we've been following the genealogy of Jesus. So in the genealogy of Jesus, I mention this every week, you find it in your Bible in Matthew chapter 1 verses 1 to 17. In the last week I had someone contact me online and tell me it actually wasn't the genealogy of Jesus, it was the genealogy of Joseph. So there's a first that I heard for that. But what the confusion is, of course, is that there's two genealogy for Jesus, and one's in Luke and one is in Matthew. They both serve the same purpose, they both fulfill prophecy, they both go from Abraham to King David through to Jesus. The difference is that the pathway from Solomon and from Nathan, his brother, takes two separate paths. One of them becomes the pathway to Mary, who is the daughter of Heli, and the other one, of course, follows the path of kings through to Joseph. But in the Bible, when we read the two genealogies, and we've taught this before, we end up with Joseph at the end of both genealogies. And the reason is because of the legal requirements. Because in genealogy, the head of the family, the male, was always the person who was actually documenting genealogy. So we find Mary by name is not in Luke, but in fact Joseph is as well. But he's there as the legal father in that situation. Okay. So this is why both of the genealogies fulfill prophecy, because we have Mary on one side and we have Joseph on the other side, and both of them come through the same descended prophetic path to become the parents of Jesus. One biological, one legal, as we know. Okay, we know that Mary became pregnant by the Holy Spirit. So it's a very interesting and powerful testimony that when we receive prophetic words which we find in the Old Testament, we find them fulfilled in the New Testament. And not only do we find them fulfilled in the traditional pathway which we call the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew, but we find in fact they're also fulfilled in the genealogy of Jesus, which of course is in Luke. There is another difference between them, of course. One goes from Jesus all the way back to Adam. The other one goes from Jesus to Abraham, or from Abraham to Jesus. But at the end of the day, they both go to Jesus. They do have slightly different purposes, but the pathways after King David diverge, go down two separate paths, and yet how incredible is it that both parents end up being the descendants of David? A lot of people don't realise this. So the genealogy that we're following, even though we pay reference to Luke, is actually from Matthew. Right? So we're following through before the time of kings, before the time of judges. So we've been in the patriarchs, so we've had a look at Abraham, we've had a look at Isaac, we have a look at Jacob, whom is still alive at this point in time, and we arrive at this part of the journey whereby all of the sons have been born, and we have found that Joseph is now in Egypt. He in fact is the ruler over all of Egypt, as we discussed last week, and yet he's not free to leave. The Bible tells us that he became Lord over all of the Pharaoh's household and ruler over all of Egypt. And I explained this with the changing of the pharaohs, that's because the pharaoh was actually a boy, the second pharaoh, and his mother was the regent. So he was too young to actually rule. So at this point in time, Joseph took over. So we understand from this what an amazing plan that God had for his people, because not only did he send Joseph first to fulfill God's plan, to fulfill the ability to provide for his family and all of the nations, right? But he actually had this plan that the very person who was pushed down the cistern and thought his life was going to be taken away from him, very soon after became the ruler over all of Egypt. So we learn from this, as we mentioned last week, that God's plan sometimes in our lives, sometimes we feel like we're on an upwards trajectory and we feel that everything's going well. And sometimes we find ourselves going down a downwards trajectory and thinking everything's not so well. But God promised Abraham and all of his descendants and all of us who are grafted onto the Abrahamic covenant that we would be blessed, and he would bless those who bless others. And so we find in this situation that through that blessing that God is always with Joseph. So even though he put him in that pathway, there was a purpose for it, wasn't it? Does anyone remember? We did ask these questions last week. What was the purpose for placing Joseph in a very specific household, didn't he? He ended up in Potiphar's house, the captain, right? And so there was a purpose in there. So what was just briefly, the chain of events that ended up seeing him ruling Egypt from there? Anyone like to?
The cupbearer, the baker.
Right, so before that he was...
The Potiphar's wife.
Tempted by the wife.
Right.
Yeah.
So the wife told a lie.
And then he got into prison.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there he met two cupbearers.
Right.
Two people,
Right.
the bread maker and the cupbearer.
Correct.
And the bread maker had a dream about crows, and the cupbearer, sorry, I can't remember that.
That's all right.
Yeah.
But they both had dreams, and then
Yeah.
Joseph...
Yes, Joseph told the cupbearer, "You're going to come back. You're going to go back to the king." So the king heard about Joseph
Right.
through this cupbearer,
Right.
and the king had a dream about cows coming, seven fat cows and seven thin cows coming
Yes.
from the river, from the Nile, and he contacted all these all the wise men and musicians, and they couldn't find it. So the cupbearer told him about this guy he met in prison,
Yeah.
and that's how Joseph got out of prison.
Right. So there's the sequence of events. We did mention last week that these sleek, fat cows were actually hippopotami. They're not cattle as people often think that they actually are.
No.
Historically, when you look up the period of time, hippopotamus, and not just there in Africa as well, they're known as cows. Right? So, and that's because they herd. Right? But they're known as cows. Obviously, in these Egyptian times, when it says that these sleek, fat cows came up out of the river, they weren't talking about Frisian dairy cows. They were talking about hippopotami that actually came out. Okay? When we look at history today, there is no hippopotami in the Nile River, but back then there absolutely was. Okay? So it's an interesting little abstract, but it's part of Pharaoh's dream. Now you have to realise the important part about this is that God's hand was on all of this. First of all, who gives dreams? God. Okay, so he gave a dream to Pharaoh that couldn't be reconciled. Who interprets dreams?
God.
Joseph made it abundantly clear, didn't he, that it's not I, but it is God through me that interprets the dreams. He made it incredibly clear. So we find that all of these steps go from Joseph going into the Potiphar's house. I did mention he could have ended up in a field somewhere, but no, he ended up in the captain's house. So he ended up in the Pharaoh's jail because Potiphar happened to be the captain of the Pharaoh's guard. So he was in the palace. So here he is in the palace jail, revealed that he can interpret, put before the Pharaoh, and then the Pharaoh says, okay, since you're the one who knows all this stuff, I'm going to make you accountable and responsible for what you said, and so I'm going to make you in charge of making sure all this happens. And suddenly what happens? Joseph is now number 2 in Egypt. He's given the signet ring, which we spoke about. Right? He's given the garments, the gold chain, and he was put on the chariot next to the Pharaoh, and people had to bow down to him. So he was given ultimate authority, second only to the Pharaoh. Right? Of course, Pharaoh, as I named him, Pharaoh Ahmose I, passed away, and so his son, Amenhotep the first, takes over, but he's only a boy. And so as a boy, he can't rule. And so suddenly we find that Joseph is ruling over the whole nation. We also mentioned that Daniel later on, when we get to it, Daniel ends up becoming the king of Babylon. So when they were put into exile the second time and under oppression, Daniel in fact became the king over Babylon. So God actually takes his people, puts them into this, what you would think is a terrible situation, but what he's actually doing is he's actually preparing the way for what comes next. So what it tells us is sometimes when we feel that life is going downhill, that sometimes God's actually preparing you for what comes next. Right? When we become oppressed or we have adversity in our life, there's 2 pathways. We can either fail or we can grit our teeth and we can climb back out of it. But sometimes we don't change our ways unless we're actually put under adversity. And that's what God does. In Hebrews 12, God tells us that he put obstacles in our path to change our path. So we know that God walks with us. Hebrews 12 tells us there's three things in life. Hindrances, there's circumstances which can affect us separately but not necessarily corporately. It could be something that can affect me but not you. There's sin, it's universal for all of us. And then there's obstacles. That's God moving big blocks in our path. Right? And we keep going because we think that's the path in life to go on, and yet it gets to the point where it becomes so impossible we finally move. And often when we start on this new path and everything starts working out, we go, why didn't I do that years ago? True? So we can see here in Joseph that God's actually put obstacles in the way because his brothers, Joseph and his brothers, were going to fulfill the prophecy that was given originally to Abraham through the covenant. Right? But we find in this journey that none of them are perfect. They all have a sin nature. They all walk away from God. But boy, oh boy, the brothers were the worst, weren't they? Okay? Reuben was a good guy. Reuben actually said, I'm not going to have any part of killing him. But he did walk away. He just put him in the cistern and said, I'm out of here. I don't want to know about it. So he wasn't really standing up to his brothers. The rest of the brothers decided, well, let's kill him. But it was Judah who actually stepped in and said, let's not kill him. Let's sell him. So the Ishmaelites came along from Midian and they sold him for 20 silver shekels. And off he went down. Right? So Judah had this role to play back at that early stage as the brother. And so we come to this part of the journey now where the brothers have actually gone down the first time after the famine, and they've gone down to get grain, and Joseph recognises them, but they don't know who Joseph is. And the reason is because he's called?
Oh, come on.
Come on, what's he called? He was 17 when he was actually sold by his brothers, but he's now around 44, was my estimate, when his brothers finally met him again. But the thing is he's speaking Egyptian. He's dressed in Egyptian finery because he's the ruler. He would be wearing the traditional makeup. And when they last saw him, he wasn't a mature man, even though he was, they're all older as well, but they were mature, so their features wouldn't have changed much, but he was still a boy. So his features would have changed somewhat. So they didn't recognise him, so he presented himself as Zaphanath-Paneah, not as Joseph. The point is, when they went down there, what did he start to do? What did he do to his brothers when they came down? Anyone remember? He accused them.
Spies.
He accused them of being spies.
Yeah.
Right? There was a purpose behind what he was doing. Right? Because he wanted them to repent of their sins. Not the direct word of the Bible, is it? But that's exactly what happened. Right? Because what happened was, when the famine hit and they had to go down there, their lives were at risk. They had nowhere else to turn. So here they find themselves before the brother, and of course we have this prophecy, don't we, that he actually spoke in his vision, where he said that you'll all bow down before me. So here they are, they're bowing down before him. So what do we have this situation? So they're bowing down, and then he starts probing and asking questions. Right? And what do? They basically start to confess their sins. All of these bad things have happened to us because we sinned. They tell Joseph that they have one brother left behind and a father, and they have one brother who is no more, the Bible says. So they stand before him saying, you don't exist anymore. So they clearly don't understand who it is. Right? So we find in this moment, they've confessed their sins. So this is the step to unifying people, is repentance. Because unless they acknowledge that they've done something wrong, how are you going to form a nation out of these people? Part of my point was, what was God going to do with them in the land of Canaan? Right? Judah's story, which we pointed out separately with Tamar, he left his family. Right? He married without his father's blessing or choosing. He had 3 children. The first 2 were so wicked, God killed them. He had one boy left, and he wasn't going to allow that boy to marry through the legal arrangements of the Hebraic law in order to have the child to earn the inheritance. Right? So Tamar, what did she do? She deceived him. Right? She slept with him, she became pregnant, 2 sons, Perez and Zerah. And Perez, of course, becomes the next descendant in the genealogy of Jesus. So we find then he goes back to his family, things didn't work out too well. But they focus on Judah because he's the next child, he's the next son in the covenant promise. And he is really significant, isn't he? Because it says from Judah the scepter will not depart. So when we come up to that and the final blessing of Jacob's given to all the sons, which we come to later tonight, we see that he gets this incredible blessing greater than any of the others. And it's another prophetic word about the fact that Jesus will come from his tribe, from his family and from his seed. And yet he's the 4th born. Okay. So while Joseph is down there, because he wants to give them a direct means of coming back forcibly, he asks which brother, they asked them together. Right? They couldn't agree about getting rid of Joseph. He now asks them together and says, well, who are you going to let me keep? And we spoke about this. Logically, it should have been Reuben because he was the eldest. He would have been the representative of the family because the father wasn't there. But of course, Joseph didn't want Reuben, did he? Because Reuben was the good guy. Right? So he took the next. He took Simeon and he withheld Simeon. And then he knew that Benjamin, his little brother, was the next favoured son of his father. He knew he hadn't come for that reason. And so what does he demand? Next time you come, bring Benjamin. Okay? So he's testing their faith. He's testing their resolve. He's putting them under pressure. So what happens when the brothers go back? They go back and they're unified because they've got the same concern that unifies them. No longer are the differences important. It's like, what are we going to say to Dad? Alright? He's not going to be happy about this. What are we going to say? So even though they may be trying to scheme, they're scheming together. They're no longer scheming against each other. But of course, Joseph blesses them. He gives them all of the grain and he puts the money back into the sacks. Right? Clearly saying he knows who they are. He also made it clear to them that he serves the same God, because he spoke to them and he called God Elohim in Hebrew. Right? They weren't talking about any other God, they were talking about the God of Israel, the God of his forefathers. And so he identified that he bowed down to the same laws as the brothers whom he was sending away. There's a pretty strong hint about who he was, but of course they're only thinking about themselves, so they didn't really pick up on it. So this is where we're going to enter back into the story. So we finished last week. We were in Genesis 42:22, and Joseph had just selected his second eldest brother Simeon, and he bound him before their eyes, and then he sent his brothers back home with the sacks of grain and obviously their money returned and provisions supplied to them for their journey back. So Judah and all of his brothers. So as you know, for those of you who are normally here, I give you constant references as we're going through so you can follow the story along in your Bible, and then we'll add and explain to that. So Judah and all of his brothers, except Simeon, set off for home with their many servants, and heavily laden donkeys weighed down with the many sacks of grain supplied to them by Zaphnath-Paneah. And we made it clear they would have been a huge entourage, because they were taking grain back not to last a week, not just for their immediate family, but for a whole community of people, to last for as long as possible, because who knew amongst them that the famine was going to last for 7 years? None of them. Joseph knew, but they didn't know. So they were just taking some indeterminate amount. So Joseph would have given them a lot, but they wouldn't have been able to last obviously for 7 years. So he sends them home. So you've got to have this picture of all these donkeys with all of these Hessian sacks or woven baskets on their backs. They would have had all their servants with them, and they would have been carting all this stuff back home. So it would have been a slow journey. So as I said, it was quite an undertaking. And I've got a little background to help explain this. When we read about their great-grandfather Abraham, we gain an understanding of how many people were involved from Genesis 14:14, when they're talking about Abraham, it actually said that he has 318 trained men born in his household, not including his immediate family, women, children, servants and slaves, when he went down to Egypt. Okay, so he's saying in his household. So this puts a figure on what it takes to run their household. Now we're several generations later. So how big was the household now? It would have been hundreds, if not perhaps thousands of people by this stage. This is one of the things by the Bible, unless we get all this contextual information, we can sometimes lose sight of what it really looked like, because we see pictures of them with their donkeys, don't we? Right? But how many donkeys would they have had? They were a huge number, and all their servants. Right? So we would find through that there would have been a considerable number of people. And the reference we can glean from is actually about Abraham, who took 318 trained men. Okay. Now in this instance, there are 10 sons who were travelling through hostile territory. They would each bring men for protection, and both servants and slaves to accommodate their every need. Remember, they're the heads of the families. Right? They all had servants. We read right back from the time of Abraham, they had maid servants and men servants. Right? People who were indentured slaves because of debt. So the wealthiest families would increase in wealth, sort of still like today, isn't it? And what did they do in those days? They didn't have any money, they didn't have any property, so they would indenture themselves. We will work for you to pay for our debt. So can you imagine in a time of famine? All the people running out of stuff, the wealthiest family with all the most animals and all the rest of it were his family. So suddenly they would have grown this great wealth through the famine, and they would have also had a lot of people who were dependent on them as a result of that. So the amount of grain they would carry home to feed these 12 households would of course be vast, so would the number of donkeys to take them. So on their way home, one of the brothers discovered that his silver, his money, in his sack. Now take notice of that. His silver in his sack. Right? So this tells you that each of the sons for their households took their money to pay for it. So it wasn't Jacob the father saying, here boys, take all this money and go and get them. He told them to go down. But each of them were paying for their own households. So each of them had their money returned to their sack. Right? So this gives you a little bit of an insight. From which he fed his donkeys. Right? That's how he discovered it, because he was taking food out of his immediate sack with his immediate donkey. Telling his brothers, their hearts sank and they trembled. And in Genesis 42:28 it says, they said to each other, what is this that? Who? God has done to us. Interesting, isn't it? Because the information that we're receiving here is they're saying, what has God done to us? Remember how we talked about how they were recognising that they had sinned and they were repentant when they spoke to Joseph. Now they're going home and finding that they're blessed, and yet at the same time saying, why has God done this to us? Thinking, now we're in trouble.
Yeah.
But they didn't say, why did the Pharaoh? Why did the Pharaoh's household? Why did the servants who put the stuff in? They said, why did God do this to us? So it's very much on their heart that they're in trouble with God, that they're sinners, and that everything that's happening that's bad, they believe it's because of what they did to Joseph, and they're acknowledging their sin. So we know that they're walking home with a repentant heart. So part of God's plan is already working. Right? His people are actually thinking about Him and how they're living their lives as a consequence of what they did before that was wrong. So occurring on the first night that they set out for home, and already accused of being dishonest spies. Remember, Joseph accused them of being dishonest spies. So the dishonest spies, they lost their brother, and now they found the money in their sacks. And they're going, God, what? How many people here, when things are going wrong, go, God, why is this happening to me? They don't point to the person, they say, God, why is this happening to me? Because when people believe that they're blessed or they walk with God, they feel that bad things shouldn't happen to them. Right? But that's not what the blessing is, as we keep saying. The blessing is that God will walk with you throughout all of these circumstances. It doesn't matter, it doesn't mean that the circumstances are going to be easy themselves. his brother was showing his love despite what they had done to him, and all they're thinking about is, oh my goodness, now I'm in more trouble. So you can see the context is different depending on who's in the situation. So the love of Joseph tells us that he already understood that God had placed him there for a reason. Without doubt. Right? He never became completely separated from his family, because when the brothers came, what happened? I told you, he turned around and wept.
Yeah.
We don't weep about people if we don't love them. Right? If he saw his brothers and he hated them, he would have had them out the back and having them strung up. But he didn't, he wept. So, in other words, he understood, he had an understanding of what was actually going on. Now Joseph, you have to understand, as part of the family, would have known about God's covenant. Do you believe that? Right? The covenant was given directly to each of the patriarchs. First to Abraham in various steps, then it was given to Isaac, then it was given to Jacob. God appeared to each of them. Right? Even though the sons were not doing the right thing, they would have been hearing from their father, hey you boys, the blessing of God and our grandfather, great-grandfather, your great-grandfather's covenant promise is going to be blessing you. Right? People don't care though when they're wealthy, do they? It's alright, I got what I need. Right? But it doesn't mean that they're not aware. They would have been aware of God's covenant. It would have been over their family now for 4 generations. So they would be very, very clear. So with their consciences awakened at this stage, they could only perceive that they were being punished by God. Judah and his brothers chose not to return to Zaphnath-Paneah in the city of On. Instead, they rose early in the morning and continued on their way. It says something about who they were as well, again, doesn't it? If you found something that wasn't right, and you were so highly concerned, wouldn't you turn back and go, look, we found this, oh, we didn't do this. But they didn't. They just sort of snuck off and took the money, took the grain, and because they would have believed in their heart that they were being punished for something wrong, but they were not necessarily intending on going back. They'd lost their brother. They were going to go home and tell their dad, we just did a Joseph again. Right? We came back and the pharaoh took him this time. It's not our fault. Right? But we got your grain. You told us to go and get grain. Right? So it's still saying that there's still something within them where they're not actually walking the right way still. They believe they're being punished with God, but they're not walking with God or for God. So of course they would have headed eastwards and retraced their steps along this road that I showed you in this map last week, which I can just pass around again if you want to have a refresh on the way to Shur. So ancient roads, for those who haven't listened, ancient roads were called way. In Israel today, a highway, as we call it. In Israel today, the roads are still called a way. Right? The way to this, the way to that, that's what a road was called. So these ancient highways were all called a way to something, or the way to something. And so that still stands today. Okay, so the journey across the Sinai Peninsula, you can imagine, would have been a long journey with all these donkeys going back home. They would have had plenty of time to be thinking about what they're going to say to their dad Jacob. So they would have gone back into the land of Canaan to this familiar territory, passed through the desert of Prsion. So all of this arduous journey, supported by the provisions given by their brother Joseph, whom they were happy to get rid of. So on the last day of their journey, they would have left the desert and ascended into the hill country where their father was. They would have arrived at Mamre, which is where? Do you remember? It's on the map there. It's at a place called next to Kiriath Arba, which is today's Hebron, south of Jerusalem. They headed straight to their father's tent, but their arrival would have caused quite a commotion. Can you imagine arriving back with all those donkeys and all that food and all those people? So the father Jacob would have heard and come out to see what was going on, and everyone in the camp would have been excited to have their loved ones returned. But some of them, I'll let you guess this one, some of them would have noticed that Simeon hadn't returned. Who would that be? perhaps his wife, his kids, his household.
Simeon is not.
He's not with them. The father, I'm sure the father would have scanned them and noticed his son was missing. So you can imagine a little bit of anxiety. There's something not quite right happening. So Judah and his brothers, they fell at their father's feet and told him what had happened. As Jacob looked up, each of the brothers returned to their feet, and after unloading the sacks of their sturdy donkeys, they would begin to open and empty them. Judah and each of his brothers found that they had all received their pouches of silver back. Right. So Judah was frightened. This is not script for script from the Bible, just explaining what would have happened. Although Judah was frightened by these unexpected state of affairs, because you can imagine Judah, whom we're following the genealogy of Jesus. So this is Judah's journey. So remember, he was the one who went back and said to his dad, "Here's Joseph's cloak. It's covered in blood. I think he was killed. Here, Dad. Is that his?" And here he is coming back, and he's now got the same situation. Remember when they were down with Joseph, Judah was kind of the spokesperson. He took it upon himself. So here he is. So Jacob's words obviously affected them the most. So in Genesis 42 verse 36, it says, "You have deprived me of my children." So we hear blame coming out here now. Joseph is no more, so we have that word about death. And Simeon is no more because he's not with them. And now you want to take Benjamin, everything is against me. Because they came back and obviously said, he wants us to go back with our brother, who Jacob had withheld. And now they're all here saying, you've got to send Benjamin if you want to get your other brother back. So Jacob's faced with lost his favourite son, his next favourite son's been asked for, and his second eldest son is gone now as well. So things aren't going so well. Remember Jacob's story? Remember he put something on the back of his neck and on his arms and deceived his father Isaac for a blessing? And you sort of think, oh, he got the inheritance for a bowl of stew. He stole the blessing from his brother by deceiving him. And then we talked about how he ended up 20 years with Laban and all the journey of what happened. He didn't get away scot-free, did he? All through his life we find that there's problem after problem after problem. Right? And so here we find again, in his older age, that he's now losing sons. He's lost his favourite wife, right? And now he's finding this situation. I haven't got the information in front of me, unfortunately, but in my Hebrew studies, I just put a post on Facebook talking about this, but we find that there's actually an Old Testament law that was fulfilled when Rachel passed away. Remember we said that she had the baby and passed away? Right? She'd committed a sin for which death was the penalty. So for next week, you can read my Facebook post, or for next week I'll dig it up to remind you. But there's actually something more to it than traditionally understood. So this is from the Hebrew understanding, those who wrote the Bible, because they see an extra layer of information because they understand the laws more intimately than we do as Christians. Right? But when Rachel, remember there was that whole process where she got pretty out of shape because she wasn't able to have a child, and then she asked the Lord in the end, can you give me a child? And then she said, I want another one. So of course she had Benjamin in the land of Canaan and she passed away. Remember she called him the what? Ben-Oni means the son of sorrow. She named him before she died. So she knew what was going to happen. And then of course Jacob changed his son's name to Benjamin. And that the reason for that was because he didn't want this negative name mantle over his son. Right? So I'll dig it up for next week and just explain that a little bit further. But what we're sort of reiterating here is that Jacob's journey through all of this is not good. Jacob's still alive, and there's all these things that are happening. All those whom he loved coming unstuck. He's lost lots, but at the end of the day, when he was a younger man, he was happy to be party with his mother, to deceive and cajole his way into the inheritance. And we spoke about that happened because she knew that he would actually inherit the covenant. The problem was they went about it their way rather than the way that the Lord had planned for them. So there's consequences. So Reuben, who had been against his brother's desire to kill Joseph, in this situation he offers the lives of his own 2 sons in exchange for his father's trust to take Benjamin. So we see something about Reuben's character once again, don't we?
Oh, I see that.
Reuben steps up to the plate and says, you know what, I'm going to stand up and be accountable. You've lost your other son, I didn't agree with that, even though he didn't disclose it to his father, but obviously that guilt and shame that he carried, he said, look, I'm going to offer my own 2 sons because I feel so bad about what's going on that I'll do that. So we learn a lot about Reuben here. He's obviously quite a decent person. But of course Jacob refuses this. So they journey through a period of time until the grain runs out, when the famine was still severe. So Jacob once again asks his sons to return to Egypt to buy more food. Obviously without food it doesn't matter whose sons are where because they're all going to die. So it changes everything. So once again we spoke about how adversity binds people together and changes the decisions that we actually make. So although Judah understood that without food they would perish, he said to his father in Genesis 43 verses 3 to 5, the man warned us solemnly, you will not see my face again unless your brother is with you. If you will send our brother along with us, we will go down and buy food for you. But if you will not send him, we will not go down. So there's an ultimatum being given. So again, you will not see my face again unless your brother is with you. If you will send our brother along with us, we will go down and buy food for you. But if you will not send him, we will not go down. So they're now standing up to their father. They're almost rebelling, aren't they? They're saying, we actually won't obey what you're commanding us to do unless you give us your youngest son. There's a reason for this, isn't there? Because they believe that if they go back without him, that they will be incarcerated, killed.
Yeah.
Selfishness. I'm worried about me. So again, we see this corporate attitude of these boys. So they're still not walking with God the right way, are they? They're not honouring. They're still seeking their own way through all of these different issues. So Jacob understands that he's powerless before the governor of Egypt. So he invokes the power of God's mercy for all to go well. So in verse 14 of Genesis 43, he says, and may God Almighty in English in your Bible is El Shaddai. And may God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, so that he will let your other brother and Benjamin come back with you. So in other words, he's placing his faith in God, but his faith is connected to mercy. And why is it connected to mercy, do you think? One of the attributes of God is that he's merciful, isn't it? When we study the Bible. So we learn from God's character that he's a merciful God. But in this situation, he's saying, may God grant you mercy. He's not saying, may Joseph grant you mercy. He's saying, and God grant you mercy before the man. So in other words, he's talking about Zaphnath-Paneah, Joseph, his son, who he doesn't know is alive, so that he will let your other brother and Benjamin come back with you. So he's assuming that through God's mercy, he will be able to receive all of his sons back again. Okay? So he knows through this that he's powerless. He has no earthly power to get his son back. He has nothing that he can offer the ruler of Egypt in a transaction to get his sons back. So what happens when all else fails in life? Who do we turn to? God. And we ask for his mercy, because there ain't nothing else that's going to solve the problem. And so we see this happening here. So it's At times like this, when we reflect on the way that Jacob has deceitfully attained the birthright of his brother Esau and the blessing of his father Isaac, that the goodness of God's mercy comes to light. Little does he know that God's plan to protect him and his family is actually in full swing. So God's mercy is already in action. He's asking to invoke it to start, but it's actually already underway because he doesn't know that Joseph was actually sent for that reason. So these actions of Joseph is actually fulfilling God's plan because he's going to draw the family back together again, but he's going to protect them and he's going to provide for them, right? Because the famine's still got a long way to go. But God's plan's bigger. Why do you think God's plan's bigger? So we're in the micro story right now, but there's something bigger going on here as well. What do you think that is? What's the bigger plan that God has in this action? Surely he could stop the famine.
I think he wants to. So he's got a plan with the 12 sons. That's going to be his tribe, his people. And he wants to bring to Egypt where the blessings are, where the food is, so they can survive and keep on going. So,
But he's going to oppress them.
yes. But it's in the you just said in the press is the growing. So.
Right. See, in oppression, we spoke about this a few times, when we oppress people together, we mould them together, they become as one. Because all of a sudden all the other details of life fall away because you've got to have a common goal together to survive. Right? So God can see down the track that he's going to have to do something pretty severe to put these people together as a nation. I think that's pretty true of any nation. Now, any nation, even today in democracy, we have people that struggle to get along with each other. So, but what happens when we end up with someone like Adolf Hitler comes along? Suddenly everyone's joining arms and saying, let's go together and fight this guy. Right? So it takes something bigger than a family, bigger than a government, bigger than a nation. Sometimes it takes some common threat to put people together and put all other things aside. So we see that this is happening in this very process right now. But there's a pathway through it. It doesn't happen instantly because God takes us on a journey. Right? Sometimes some of us learn earlier on the journey and sometimes people take longer. Those of us who learn earlier become the leaders. Those who don't learn so early become the followers. Right? But as people suffer more and more and they stand with their leaders, gradually they form a nation together. So we see this happening through this. Okay, so Judah and his brothers, they obviously back down to Egypt again and present themselves to Zaphanath-Paneah. They couldn't understand what he said to his steward, but the steward took the brothers to his house. Right? Remember, they can't speak the language. Thinking they were going to be attacked and made slaves. Remember, Joseph told them, his steward, that he was to bring them back to his house. So we've gone from them probably the first time meeting in a public place to now actually going back to a private place. We know there's a reason for this because there's going to be something revealed to them. So he takes them back to a safe place to do this. So the steward's sent to bring them back to the house. So they address the steward at the entrance to the house with a protest of innocence over the returned silver. Suddenly they remember the silver. Oh yeah, that's right. Oh, we got that money. Sorry, it wasn't our fault. We just found them in the sacks. Please, tell him that we didn't take it intentionally. But the steward said he had received their silver, and in verse 23 of Genesis 43, he says, "Your God," interesting, "your God," so in other words, he's not walking with the Lord. He's Joseph's steward. "The God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver." He then brought Simeon out to them. Well, hang on a second. What was that? Let's read it again. "Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver." Who put the silver in the sacks?
Steward.
But didn't he just say that God put it in the sacks?
Yeah, that's a putting. It's
What do you
really
think?
good.
Do you think he's covering, or do you think he's actually saying, well, hang on a second here. It's God who's blessed you. Funny, isn't it? We can read the Bible 100 times and miss what sometimes seem to be these major statements. And we find here that it is God that put the silver. The steward said that he received it. So then, of course, they arrived. So he honoured the agreement that Joseph had made with Zaphnath-Paneah, and he brings Simeon out to them. So he reunites the brother with the other brothers. So Joseph's steward, a personal and trusted man, had been brought to know the God of their father. Doesn't mean that he was walking with him, but he clearly knew of him through Joseph. Like their great-grandfather Abraham, the sons of Jacob went to Egypt in a time of famine and left more prosperous than when they arrived. The story repeats. Remember what God said? He will always be with them. He will bless them. And just like Abraham, despite their sin and lack of trust in God the Father, God blessed them and ensured that he protected the covenant from which our Lord Jesus Christ would come. So you can imagine this striking them when they come back and they're all repentant about what's happened, and suddenly it's like, oh my goodness, we've been blessed even though we've done the wrong thing again. So what's this doing to their heart? It's starting to change them, isn't it? It's starting to, right. They're starting to realise there's something much bigger and more powerful than them at work in their lives. Right? So they would have to start thinking about the covenant, I would imagine. So Judah joined his brothers, taking turns to embrace Simeon with great relief. Zaphnath-Paneah's steward, now I talk about him in these terms because this is the context which they're walking in. The Bible will call him Joseph, right? But the steward knows him as Zaphnath-Paneah. The brothers know him as Zaphnath-Paneah at this point in time, right? The Bible tells us he gave them water to wash their feet and fodder for their donkeys, and once Judah refreshed himself from taking care of his donkeys, he, like his brothers, would have prepared gifts for the governor of Egypt, as he had heard that they were to eat with him there in his home. Remember the father? He said to take gifts. Right. So he's like, you better humble yourself, boys. Take a present, say thanks. We're not just talking about an exchange of money for goods, we're talking about the fact that there's a grace, that they're going to actually receive something which they didn't have to give them, and yet here they are. So when Zaphnath-Paneah arrived, Judah joined his brothers, bowing down to the ground before him. Here we go again, they're bowing down before their brother. Judah nervously presented the gifts that his father had given to him for this occasion. Again, I'm tracking Judah because of the genealogy. In Genesis 37:7, just going back a bit, the prophecy of Joseph's first dream came to pass. And it said, we were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while our sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. This is the point where that prophecy is fulfilled. Why? Because why did they go down there? What did they go down there for? Grain. So now you get to understand, it wasn't just random cows and grain because they were two selected items out of everything. There's actually a fulfilment of prophecy that's actually happening here.
Yes.
Right? And part of that fulfilment of the prophecy, of course, is that they went down to get grain. So God's provision was in this. Okay? So we see that this is revealed at this point in time. So Joseph asked after his father and met his younger brother and wept for joy. He's weeping again. Right? He's caring about his father. Still not revealing who he was, though, he instructed his stewards to give them as much food as they could carry. Again returned their silver, but this time to put his personal silver cup in the sack of Benjamin. So they obviously enjoyed this feast. Early the next morning, they would have got up at dawn. They would have left with their servants and donkeys to head home to the land of Canaan once again. Judah and his brothers were just outside the city, but this time the circumstances were different. They didn't travel a day away and then go to get some food for the donkey and find the silver there. Zaphnath-Paneah's steward caught up with them, and they would have been perplexed and worried, why was he coming after them, especially after the previous time. So in Genesis 44 verses 4 to 5, he says, "Why have you repaid good with evil? Isn't this the cup my master drinks from and also uses for divination? This is a wicked thing you have done." Judah protested with his brothers. In verses 7 to 9 it goes on to say, so once again, we hear about how people are very willing to offer up someone to be killed. We heard this with Judah before, didn't he? Right? With Tamar. Right? He called her out as a prostitute and said, "Bring her out, let's kill her." Right? When he got discovered, it's like, "Oh, sorry, she's more righteous than I." But he didn't offer to kill himself. So here he is again with his brothers, and we find that they're offering to kill the servants. But for the rest of them, he says, "We'll be slaves, thanks. So we'll submit to your authority, but we don't want to actually die, but it's all right if our servants do." Nice guys, eh? So we find again some more about their character. So the steward replies in verse 10, "Very well then, let it be as you say. Whoever is found to have it will become my slave, the rest of you will be free from blame." So in agreement, Judah and his brothers lowered the sacks on the ground. Each of them was searched from the oldest brother to the youngest. The cup in question, of course, was found in whose sack? Benjamin. So we find this, if we look at God's plan, it's very pointed, isn't it? All these things, there's a whole pile of steps that are happening, and it's very predetermined about whom is actually affected and why. So the cup was found in Benjamin's. Judah fell to his knees with his brothers. They would have torn their clothes in despair. This is what they did in those days. When they despaired or something went wrong, put ash on their heads and they would tear their clothes. They would grieve this way very publicly. So Judah would have relayed his donkey with his brothers and returned to the governor's house in the city as they saw him. So having guaranteed his father the safe return of Benjamin, Judah spoke out. So here we find out, this is why I mentioned about Judah's story, because it's Judah who actually speaks out. He confessed their guilt, their corporate guilt, for their former sin and accepted the consequences as punishment for their actions. In verse 16 of Genesis 44, he says, "God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my Lord's slaves." What was that about them bowing down? They're now submitting as slaves. So Judah offers all his brothers and himself as slaves, but still Zaphnath-Paneah does not accept. He makes it clear he will only detain Benjamin. The penny didn't drop, did it? Here's Joseph, he's determined to have Benjamin, and the brothers are so focused on themselves, they're not thinking, why Benjamin? They know that they're going to have a problem with their father because they understand that Benjamin's favoured by the father, he didn't let them go with them. And yet here's Joseph determined to have Benjamin, but the penny doesn't seem to drop with them. They're concerned about themselves. So Judah pleads with him and again offers himself as a slave, knowing he cannot return to his father without his younger brother. So once again it's about them. They're worried about themselves. Eventually Zaphnath-Paneah cleared the room of all but his brothers, no longer able to control himself. Again, third time, he wept and told his brothers in verse 3 of Genesis 45, "I am Joseph, is my father still living?" So they've confessed their sin, they've bowed down to Joseph, and now Joseph has said, "Okay, enough is enough," and he reveals who he is. So having revealed himself to his brothers, Joseph tells them not to be distressed or angry at themselves for what they had done, for God had sent him ahead to save their lives. So Joseph reveals to his brothers that in fact this has been God's plan all along. So obviously Joseph must have known this. Right? Again, Joseph wasn't just walking in life thinking, "Oh, this is happening, that's happening." He actually understood that he had been sent first. So the famine had run for 2 years and still had another 5 to go. So he told them to bring his father, all their families and all of their livestock to Egypt to live close by in the region of Goshen. This news reached the pharaoh and his officials, whom were all pleased. Now I've got another picture here. This is a picture of Joseph as he would have been dressed, and Judah as the costume or the clothes that they wore in the day. So Judah was there pleading with his brother. So this is an artist's impression of that. So having revealed so the famine ran for 2 years. So this news reached the Pharaoh and his officials, whom were all pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph in verses 17 and 18 of Genesis 45, "Tell your brothers, do this. Load your animals and return to the land of Canaan and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt and you can enjoy the fat of the land." So remember, he's ruling over Egypt, and so he gets to actually deliver the best of the land. God's plan in action, right? His covenant promise, he's going to take care, he says he's going to protect and provide for his people. And so here we find that that's actually the case. So Judah and his brothers receive the cart and provisions for their journey from the Pharaoh. So in other words, the Pharaoh realises that he wants to make it more comfortable, and he wants to give them equipment to make the journey more comfortable. He's going to bring his elderly father back. And they were given new clothing. So obviously by this time, unlike the other times, they wouldn't have been able to wait to get back to the day, because finally they got some good news to reveal. And they can also tell his dad finally that Joseph in fact is still alive. So big news. So unlike their previous return visit, they would have been journeying home in high spirits. So arriving back in the land of Canaan, Judah and his brothers told Jacob in verse 26 of Genesis 45, "Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler of all Egypt." So once again we get that word ruler, so we know he's in charge, because the Egyptian pharaoh is still a boy. His father was astonished. In fact, he didn't believe them. Judah was hardly surprised, because they've told so many lies by this stage. You can imagine being the father, they'd be like, "You sure this is true?" So he understood that all the lies of deceit he and his brothers had treated the father with in the past, that he would not trust what they had to say. So here's Jacob not trusting his sons, and yet what did he do to his father? He deceived him as well. So the cycle, the full circle is going around here. So they explained at length what Joseph had told them. Then they showed him the 10 donkeys carrying the best things from Egypt, the 10 female donkeys carrying grain, bread and other provisions for his journey, and the carts that Joseph had sent to bring him back on. The significance of this was not lost on Jacob. His spirit was revived, and he said in verse 28, "I'm convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." So this tells you that he is indeed elderly, and he doesn't expect that he's going to live much longer. So he feels comfortable that once his family's back together, he can rest in peace. So Jacob's clan, and it's a clan by now, it's a lot of people, they moved to Goshen, and they moved during the reign, as I said, of the previous week, of a pharaoh called Amenhotep I. Now when we have a look at this, if we look at the family members in the Bible, their immediate family members were 66 in total. Okay, between the sons that were actually born, or daughters, wives, husbands, there were 66 in total. When Judah returned to Egypt, he took with him his 3 remaining sons. They were Shelah, the one that was left over from his first marriage to Shua, and there was Perez and Zerah. He also took his grandsons, the sons of Perez, Hezron and Hamul. So the Bible reveals to us that he has grandsons. So when I spoke about the genealogy of Jesus and how each verse contains sections of history in them, we find here that the next generation was actually born outside of Egypt as well. And so Jacob is going back with his sons and his sons' sons. So there's actually 4 generations. So it gives you a different perspective, doesn't it? So they would have been from very little to very old, hence the carts. Would have been good for the little kids, the wives, the grandfather, all the rest of it to go on. Okay, so they were all born in the land of Canaan. So in the Bible, Perez is the next generation in the genealogy of Jesus after Judah, and Hezron is actually the next generation after Perez. Okay, so 4 generations of the covenant, right, in the genealogy of Jesus: Jacob, Judah, Perez and Hezron, all going down to Egypt together at this point in time. So Judah and his family, and his brothers and their families, and his servants, they would have packed up all their belongings. So you can imagine, packed everything up that they had, put everything on the carts, and they would have set off back down the highway. So they would have been getting to know this highway by now. His father Jacob, they stopped at Beersheba on the way down. Beersheba is a significant place. Right? Beersheba's there. I remember what the name means from the previous lessons. There were 7 wells, or they believe it's another word, it's the well of oath. Right, now the well of oath was named with Isaac, right, because he dug an extra well, and then the other wells had been dug by Abraham before him. So the story when he was being pursued by the herdsmen from the Philistine king, Abimelech in Gerar, it says that the Abraham's wells had been filled, and then they had dug them back out again, but then they kept moving away as they were being persecuted. So we find in this situation that once again there was an extra well that was dug, and that was the one by Isaac. So they stopped there and made sacrifices. In Genesis 46 verse 1 it says the sacrifices were offered to the God of his father Isaac. So we find that that previous generation is honoured at that point in time. So God spoke to Jacob in a vision that night and said to him in verses 3 to 4 of Genesis 46, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back, and Joseph's hand will close your eyes. What does that mean? He's going to die there, so he's going to close his eyes. It's final. Right, so he knows before he goes he's going to die there, but he also says that I'll make you a great nation there. So that's a bigger story behind that than what we may understand at that point in time, because not only are they going to be great because they're big and wealthy, but they're going to become a people together where they weren't in the land of Canaan. So Jacob was told that his people would grow into this great nation in Egypt, that when he died, Joseph will be with him to close his eyes, his most beloved son would close his eyes, and that his remains would be brought back from Egypt to the promised land of Canaan. It says in the Bible that as they approached the Nile Delta, Jacob sent him ahead to meet with Joseph so he could get directions to Goshen. So Judah went ahead. Now, I've got another map here for you, and I've marked on here, again subject a lot of research, the area of Goshen. Okay. Now remember what I said, these will be posted on the video on YouTube. Remember that I said last week that where Joseph was ruling from was a city called On.
Yes.
Right, which is called Heliopolis today. It was renamed by the Greeks. Okay. Now, we also said that because they were shepherds, the Egyptians considered them lower, right? They weren't to be in the cities, they weren't to be in contact with the wealthy people around homes. They were outcasts of society. So when they were brought to the best of the land, they were not talking about the land in terms of big buildings, that sort of wealth. They were talking about land as in area for them to graze their animals, water, etc., etc. So the Nile Delta is the greenest and most highly watered area. So he took them to the land of Goshen. So when they were going there, they were not going to live with Joseph. So I want to make that clear. Joseph was ruling this nation. He was to rule it for another 5 years. He was not living with them. He was living in the palace. He had his wife, Asenath, right, and his father-in-law was the high priest of Ammon. Okay, so he was in this completely different world, submersed in a world who worshipped this false god, whilst he was actually doing God's bidding, right? So he was going to remain separate from the rest of his family, even though they were coming to the same nation. So have a look at there where the city of On is. Have a look at where Goshen is. Now the reason I know where Goshen is, I mentioned last week that ancient Egypt was divided up into what were called nomes, right? And nomes are districts, right? Geographical areas with borders that were governed by regional governors. The city of On was in the 13th nome. Goshen was another nome. So you can actually research and find the ancient boundaries for that actual land. So that's where that marked area is on the top of there. You can see it overlaps some of the desert, but on the one side it's on the Nile Delta, it's got water within it, it's got the city of Avaris within it, and this will become a significant thing later on, because when the Egyptians go to finally release these people from Ramses, as it becomes known, Ramses wasn't around at this time, didn't exist. It's a city that was built later on. Why do we know that? The Bible tells us. What were the slaves later to do? They were to build the cities of Ramses and Pithom. Right? So at this point in time, those cities didn't exist. So they are marked on the map, but it was called Avaris. So Avaris is a very small place, like a town, and then it was built into a major city by a later pharaoh. Okay. Let's find what I'm up to.
Thank you.
Okay. So Judah went ahead to find where his brother was. They informed his brother of his father's imminent arrival along with all their people. So he returned to them and led them to where Joseph agreed to meet them in the region of Goshen. So this tells us that Joseph wasn't living there, that he's actually coming there to actually meet them. So waiting in the agreed destination, Judah and his brothers, they would have sensed their father's yearning. Could you imagine after all these years? His father would have been absolutely humming, waiting to see his son again, trying to picture what he's like, what it was his life like, all those sort of things. So in a short period of time, it says in the Bible that Joseph arrived on a chariot, so he would have been watching this plume of dust coming down the road and peering to see what he looked like. So it was Joseph on the chariot, but he wouldn't have recognised him at first because he would have been regaled in his Egyptian attire on this chariot. So he jumps off his chariot, and in verses 29 to 30 of Genesis 46, it says, "As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time." So Joseph's obviously a bit of a crier. This is the fourth time the Bible's mentioned that he wept, but it just shows you how much love he had for his family, because it's showing something about emotions with Joseph. A lot of the other stories about all the other people, you keep hearing about their selfishness, about how they're worried about themselves all the time. But whenever it speaks of Joseph, it always talks about his emotions, how he loved them, how he wept for them. So we see this happening again. So Israel said to Joseph, what was that the Bible just said? Israel said to Joseph, "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." So in this, the prophecy of Joseph's second dream came to pass. And that's the one from Genesis 37:9, which says, "This time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Jacob had scolded him for this, and yet he came to Egypt with his wife and his sons and the rest of his extended family, and placed himself under the authority of his son Joseph. Okay. Now, interestingly, this is the point in the Bible, the first time that Jacob is actually called Israel. Okay, up until then he's still called Jacob. So there's points in the Bible where we see the shifts of names from Hebrews to Israelites, from Jacob to Israel. God wrestled with him and he says that he's renaming him, but he never actually spoke of his name by name until this point in time. So this is that point where he becomes Israel for the first time. Okay, so where are we up to? So Judah watched on. He would have been grateful for his younger brother's forgiveness, and he was relieved to see his father's joy, and he was looking forward to the promise that Joseph had made to him. In verse 18 from Genesis 45, remember the promise of Joseph? He said, "I will give you the best of the land of Egypt and you can enjoy the fat of the land. Okay? So Joseph addressed Judah with his brothers, his father and all their households. In Genesis 46, where we are now in verses 31 to 32, it says, I will go up and speak to Pharaoh and will say to him. So he's actually saying something here, isn't he? Because there's still a Pharaoh. He's a boy, right? He's been given the authority to rule, but he's obviously still in communication with his Pharaoh. There's obviously a communication process whereby they have to actually have some knowledge of what's going on. So in this time he says, I will go up and speak to Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who are living in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds. They tend livestock and they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. So he's making clear what their function is. Right? Remember I said that they can't actually live with him because of their function. So Judah was selected with 4 of his brothers by Joseph to be presented before the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh asked them, what is your occupation? So we're in Genesis 47 now, verses 3 to 4. Your servants are shepherds, just as our fathers were. We have come to live here a while because the famine is severe in Canaan, and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now please let your servants settle in Goshen. With Joseph in attendance, the question and answer was interpreted so all could understand. The Pharaoh said to Joseph in verses 5 to 6, your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen, and if you know any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock. So again, the blessing of the household. Judah was pleased with this outcome. His brother Joseph had told him that Pharaoh would ask them what their occupation was. So we notice this whole conversation is around their occupation. This is determined because Joseph says, go to the land of Goshen. He knew that what the Pharaoh was going to say. So he says, give him the best of the land in Goshen because this is the best of the land. And so this, of course, is what actually happens. He also told them to say they were shepherds. This was because Joseph knew his Pharaoh would have them settle in Goshen, as I just mentioned. In verse 34 it says, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. Detestable. So he knew exactly what to do and how to manage this before it actually happened.
The New King James Version actually says abomination.
Abomination,
it says abomination.
Yeah. There you go. So strong words, aren't they? Yeah. So it was, Judah settled his family in the district of Ramses as the Pharaoh had directed. Okay, so after this meeting, Joseph brought his father to meet with Pharaoh, and this is the part where we get to a bit of insight into the age of the Pharaoh, because the Pharaoh asked, how old are you, in verse 8? You see, Jacob at this stage was 130 years old and already a great-grandfather. This was a curious question of wonder for Pharaoh Amenhotep I, for he was still a child himself. This is one of the ways from the Bible we can determine that he was still a child. Because you can imagine a little child looking at an elderly man going, wow, how old are you? Remember we talked about how old the Egyptians lived to? The Egyptians were not long-lived people. Right? As I mentioned, the rulers of Egypt, on average for all of Egyptian history, was only 15 years of rule. Right? Some of them lived longer, some of them lived shorter. Right? A lot of them didn't make it because they had lots of illness problems. Right? Brothers and sisters were having children together because they believed they were gods and they couldn't have babies otherwise. There was lots of stillborn babies. There was diseases. When they go through the mummies today, I had a look at all this. They have all sorts of diseases. Most of them had scoliosis, right? So they had terribly curved spines. They had teeth projecting out. You know, a lot of them had scabies, skin diseases. So you know when we see the movies and you see this big pharaoh with his gold, not true. Right? You look at these mummies, and when they do all these scans with modern technology through their bodies, they can spot all the diseases. Right? So they were short-lived. And so you can imagine a boy pharaoh in this land seeing a man that's way over 100 years old going, wow, I've never seen someone so old before. And so this sows into that understanding of that scripture. It's funny, you know, the Bible gives us all these little scriptures and verses, and they give us this insight, but if we don't understand them in context, we will often miss out on all this stuff. This is part of what makes the Bible so rich. So Genesis 47 verses 27 we're going to now. It says, "Now the Israelites settled in Egypt at the region of Goshen. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number." The situation for the people of Egypt and the people of Canaan, however, is very different. Are you getting what's going on here? There's a famine. Joseph's family arrive, and the Bible tells us that they received property, they were fruitful and greatly increased in number. After that, there was nothing left to give. The Egyptians sold themselves into bondage. Do you understand the implications of what's going on? God sent Joseph down to prepare to take care of his people. They got the best of the land. But the Bible tells us at the same time that the Egyptians gave everything they had to the pharaoh to pay for the grain. So what that actually meant is that the pharaoh became more powerful. Well, who was ruling at the time? Joseph. The people who were going to enslave the Hebrews were now actually slaves themselves. They had nothing. They didn't own their land anymore. They didn't have any livestock anymore. They didn't have any grain. They didn't have any money. They had nothing. Later on, when we come to it, the Bible tells us that a future pharaoh got upset and he said, "These Hebrew people are too powerful." Right? Well, isn't this obvious why now? Because they were in bondage, they had nothing left. So when God actually brought Joseph into the land to provide, the situation ended up being that the people who actually enslaved Joseph ended up becoming enslaved to him because all of their possessions, their worldly possessions, were taken away. Powerful, isn't it? Amazing.
Interesting.
So Joseph gave them seed to grow crops, but established that a fifth of all produce grown was to be given to the pharaoh. So he sustained, from that point in time, he sustained a form of tax. Right? So they didn't have anything, so he's giving them the grain now. And when they grew it, they had to give a portion back to the pharaoh all the time. Sounds a lot like tithing, doesn't it? So Joseph's obedience to God prospered his own people in Egypt, whilst the free people of Egypt became enslaved to their god, the Pharaoh. So again, Joseph's obedience to God prospered his own people in Egypt, whilst the free people of Egypt became enslaved to their god, who was the Pharaoh. So when the famine ended after 7 years, just as the Lord had told Joseph, Joseph had steered the land of Egypt through this crisis and delivered a boy Pharaoh untold wealth and ownership over the land within his kingdom. Joseph at this stage had turned 43 years old, a year when Pharaoh Menachet I would step out from his mother care to rule over Egypt independently. So history tells us that this Pharaoh, at the end of Joseph's rule and the end of the famine, stepped in as a man. Incredible. So this is part of that study I've been doing over the years with aligning the pharaohs. We find that as the Bible ends one phase, we see history matches up with it. Right, the pharaoh began to rule. So Joseph's time, God said that he would be there to rule over them during the time of famine. Put food away for 7 years, there will be 7 years of famine. That's what remember when we first talked, he was put in to govern on that basis, not for anything else, not to go to war, not for anything else, just to provide.
Yes.
And so at the end of this period of time where the famine came to an end, his job basically was done, and then the Pharaoh steps into his role. Quite extraordinary. So Pharaoh Menachet I, he kept Zaphnath-Paneah, Joseph, governing the land of Egypt, not being Pharaoh anymore, not lord over his household anymore, but governing the land of Egypt from the city of On, even though he become of age. So as a king, and this is the thing you need to understand in these days, he concerned himself not with the administration of his kingdom, for that was actually the role of the governor. So, and what more trusted a person could he have in this role than a man of God who had delivered his nation from starvation and made him a wealthy ruler in the process? Kings in those days went to war. Kings were not in the business of menial tasks. They weren't in the day-to-day governing of their land, worried about who's actually doing what, who's growing what, how many people are living there, all that sort of stuff. He had other people to do that, right? The king was there to be a figurehead of power. And so his main role was that if they were actually under threat, that he would head his army and go out to war to show that he was in fact a god, because he was all powerful and no one could beat him. So the pharaohs, the boys, would train in the art of war. Right, that was their main concern, not the governing of the land itself. So Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years, so we know this from the aging in the Bible. He was aged 147. Knowing his time was short, he called for Joseph and made him promise to take his body to be buried with his forefathers Abraham and Isaac in the land of Canaan. Sometime later, when Joseph told his father was ill, he brought his two sons Manasseh and Ephraim to be blessed. Jacob claimed them both as his own sons and blessed them with 2 of the 12 future tribes of Israel. I mentioned this last week. There's not actually 12 tribes anymore, there's actually 13. Right, but one tribe was the Levites, and they were to be the priesthood, and so the 2 boys of Joseph in fact formed 2 tribes. Okay, so I pose a question here: if 2 tribes came from Joseph through his sons Manasseh and Ephraim, wouldn't they number 13? Of course the answer is yes, because Levi and his descendants would fulfil the role of the future priesthood. So they actually didn't inherit land. Right? So the covenant promise, remember the covenant promise is important. The covenant promise, part of the promise is that they would actually inherit the land. Right? The 12 tribes of Israel. But the 13th tribe didn't inherit land. Right? When they moved into the land of Canaan and formed the nation, there was 40 priestly cities around Israel. Right? People brought to them what they needed. They did actually have animals and whatnot to fulfill their needs as people, right? But they never owned the land. They were given a place to live in order to serve the Lord, and people would bring to them to take care of them. But they would never inherit the land. So the covenant promise stays intact because of that. So coming on from there, so then Jacob called for all of his sons to gather around. So remember, when people died, they would give their blessing. Right, we learned this with the previous generation. Right, Jacob actually stole the blessing, didn't he? He deceived his father Isaac and took the blessing for what was meant to be for Esau. Okay, so before people died, they want to give their blessing to the next generation. So this is what he's doing. Remember, God told him that he is going to die here in the land, so he's very aware of it. So under the spirit of prophecy, he blessed each of them, for amongst them were to come forward the 12 tribes of Israel. This was a call of love and unity. They were to stay together and not to mingle with the Egyptians, not to separate and divide as the sons of Abraham and Isaac had done. Through Jacob, the Holy Spirit was declaring that they were to be one people unified together as the nation of Israel. We're just about to finish. So in speaking farewell to his sons, Jacob foretells what the future holds for each of his descendants. Now I'm just going to speak of Judah's because we're following the genealogy of Jesus. Right? And Judah's is, of course, the most important of all of the blessings. So they would have each got their blessings in order. So you can imagine them sitting there. And he's going Reuben first, Simeon next, then Levi. Levi would have walked out of the tent and found that he had no land. Right? And then, of course, it was the 4th child, and that was Judah. So what does his father say? So we go to Genesis chapter 49, where all of this is. So we're hitting the end of Genesis now. Verses 8 to 10. And I've just put in the main components here.